Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our series on menstruation the righteous way. I'm Aksha.
I'm Ima Precious.
I'm here with Deidre. And we are a representation of the Anu Women's Ministry. We are part of the Anu Life Global Ministry. And we wanted to present information and deeper understandings of menstruation and separation, cleanness, and uncleanness. And so, in this episode, what we'll be focusing on is menstruation and separation. I will begin with a precept. My precept comes from Leviticus 15:19 to 23. And if a woman have an issue, and her issue in her flesh be blood, she shall be put apart 7 days, and whosoever toucheth her shall be unclean until the eve. And everything that she lieth upon in her separation shall be unclean. Everything that also she sitteth upon shall be unclean. And whosoever toucheth her bed shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the eve. And whosoever toucheth anything that she sat upon shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until eve. And if it be on her bed, or anything whereon she sitteth, when he toucheth it, he shall be unclean until eve.
Thank you for that, Sister Masha. So in that series of verses, what we have is the idea of being put apart or set apart. And when you think about it, it's like, well, what's the difference whether you're put apart or set apart? And why? Why are the women, right, identified already, we know, as unclean during this time of what is Niddah? Why is that? And so what we're really striving to do here in the second episode is identify some of the practical applications. So give some more of that context and definitions, but really, how do you make this real? How, if you're living by and under Levitical law, how does that happen now? So in digging through that, we're going to kind of define a few things. So of course, Sister Deidre in the previous episode did touch on Niddah, and this being the time of being put apart or set apart. And it's truly an acknowledgement of your uncleanliness and an act of purification to choose to be put apart and separate from your community at that time. And even to some degree, your physical interaction and contact with family. And this is because, as we touched on, the women who we're speaking to and what we're referencing are the women who are mated to or flanking or supporting those priests, not so much supporting, but flanked with and connected to the priest. And again, in Leviticus, there's Moses having this discussion with Aaron. So the idea of being put apart or separate goes to Strong's H5079. And it's about, and we give these references, the biblical precepts and the Strong's references for you to really explore and dig into this for yourself. And don't necessarily take our word for it, but really go see what it means for you as far as practical applications. When you think about connecting with that separation or being put apart, it's acknowledging an uncleanness, right? Or filthiness is another way that Strong's breaks it down. And with that, there is a general overall uncleanliness which connects directly to any blood that is released from the body, or any fluids that are released from the body. So it isn't just blood, but that's the one that we're primarily focused on. And that idea of maintaining that purity. So with the purity, there's of course the ceremonial purity that we touched on last episode, as well as the purity or impurity of the blood itself. So just to touch on a few of the practical ways that one can separate. If you're a mother and you're parenting girls, it's really, really important that you prepare them for the idea of separation. having a separate facilities that they're using, even the linens and the clothing items that they, there was a focus on what you sit upon, right, and what you touch it. And so, sometimes the vernacular can be very antiquated if you're thinking and you're reading from that King James Version, but that's simple. What you're sitting on and what you're touching becomes unclean and remains that way until whatever that appropriate cleansing cycle, whether it be time or water, until those things come in to purify it, which is why it's important that those items are carved out for you or for those in the homestead, the women of the homestead during that period.
I think that's so key. Like, when we think unclean, you may be thinking like, well, why am I unclean? Because I have my period. And I think, the scripture that the systematic precepted and what you just reiterated, it is not just like the woman. There's a, list of this is what's unclean. It's any kind of fluid or discharge from the body. And because as women, we menstruate every month, we are going to go through that unclean period every month. It doesn't mean that, you're bad, you're dirty. It means that you're going through an unclean period and you have to follow the rules of how to keep everyone else from being unclean. That's what it means. So what are like some practical ways, like Ima Precious has talked about, raising daughters. What about mated women? Like, if you are in a household with your husband and you have one bathroom, that means he's going to be unclean, until the next evening. If you're using the same bathroom, if you're sitting on the same sofa, if you're sleeping in the same bed, unless you can work out arrangements in your home where, during that time, one of you sleeps someplace else, or you figure out like another way to, use the bathroom. But in a lot of ways, like we're talking about practical application, right? It's probably not something you're going to do. So you're going to have to, you're just unclean. Does it make it right? No, because when we're talking about Levitical law, like ignorance of the law or not being able to, adhere because of something that's in the way is no excuse for not following it. So that means then we have to start thinking about how do we put ourselves in places where we can adhere to Yah's law without compromising, right? So those are some things that we have to think about. Like in the meantime, does it mean you're gonna be unclean? Probably, yes. That means then there has to be that evolution of thought on how can we get to a place of being uncompromising when it comes to upholding God's law. We can talk about plural situations. This is where it becomes, great, because you have that sisterhood that helps you navigate those times. But one thing I want to pull on, from that, because I know we can dive a little bit deeper into that, but it really also means being honest and being healthy. Because when you are honest, then, everyone can kind of shift as they need to move around and keep themselves from being unclean or keep you from making someone else in the household unclean. The other part of that, which is really important, is being healthy, because then we can be very sure, or as close as possible, as to how our cycles are flowing, right? And so we don't necessarily have surprises. And we know how the period moves. Untitled Global Ministries has Red Wrap, and we know there's some, it came 2 days earlier, 2 days late. Like there's some things that happen, but if you are healthy, you can kind of figure that out. When we're unhealthy, then we have other issues of uterine discharge, that is blood, abnormally bloody emissions or zava. Women who have, uterine issues that cause abnormal bleeding. So that means you're in this stage of, uncleanness. So, when we're going through that, we have to make sure that we're really paying attention to our bodies so that we can move accordingly. The other piece of that is the 7 days, right? So when we have our period, the average time of menstruation is about 5 days, some 5 to 7 days. But if you bleed for 5 days, there's still a 7-day purification period, the Damei Tahora. You have to, purify for 7 days. So even if you have a period, maybe your period lasts for 3 days, you still have to add on an extra 7 days after that last day of your cycle, that flow, after that last day of bloody emission. You have to add on 7 days to go through your purification. And at the end, certain cultures do have rituals for purification called mikvahs. again, but then there's ways to figure out how do we apply practically. And in many cases, there's not necessarily a way. So that's, again, evolution of thought. How do we get to that space?
You know, I wanted to add just a little bit onto the idea of, you know, practical ways, right? Because, you know, I do think sometimes you may say, oh, well, the space is too small. But I definitely think that there are ways that we can carve out a space in the home where we reside as women during that time, right? Whether you want to call it sacred space or it's just specifically, not just because it's for me, my sacred time, but it's literally a way to ensure and secure the purity of the homestead overall. Some of us may not be in plural households, so it may make sense to think about now Life Global Ministries as a community. So if you are communal, though you may not be in a plural household, let's just consider that for a moment, then it is very easy for you to be able to rely on another sister to support you during that period of time. And you know, it becomes very easy because you know you may all be on a flow. As Sister Deidre said, it becomes very easy to identify when that cycle comes around. So that may be something that is practical for you as well. You may be able to get someone to support you with food prep, right? Or even working with the youth so that way you don't transfer some of that uncleanness to them. Because hugging and touching, of course, as the precept indicates, makes you unclean. You know, identifying linen that are specifically for you during that period of time is also important, even though we wash and clean as women, we go through that process, but making sure you have identity, and you can make it a color that is very clear to everyone else that, you know, this is the time period, right? You put a flag on your door, I don't know. But it's always good to have something that makes everyone in the home aware of what that time period is, or what's actually happening and why there's a shift. So, you know, like I'll just end on that. I just wanted to share that there are additional, you know, little things that we can do that are practical to help to maintain that purity.
And you know, before we close out, the idea of why do you want to practically apply? Really quickly, it was touched on earlier, and I know in the previous episode who we're speaking to and from what perspective we're speaking from. But I want to just touch on the ramifications of being in physical contact, or even, you know, placing those around you, the priests, the men of your community, of your home, in contact with you, because there's this idea of, well, I don't want to be set apart, even though there is a sacred component to being set apart, right, or put apart. And we tend to lean to set apart because I think it has like more of an attractive, I'll say, aura to it. But being put apart is just as attractive. You're putting yourself apart. You're separating yourself from ceremonial activities or rituals within your community during this time, which we haven't touched on just yet. You're not participating in those activities so as to ensure that you don't defile the space. And it's not just about defiling the space and making it dirty, but it's also about limiting the potential of what can happen in that space. And so connecting that to who we serve, right? Our master is our headship. So if our head is a priest, then you're limiting his ability to serve his community by making him unclean or placing him in circumstances where you're the only one who is going to prepare his food, and you haven't planned ahead and made preparations in advance. You're not a part of a plural home, so you don't have those a sister or those sisters to support during that time. You may not have that extra bathroom, but the why is you don't want to compromise the community for yourself, for the one. So this is why Moses was making it really clear to Aaron that he has to know the difference. As the man, as the priest, he has to know clean from unclean, so that he can ensure that the women that are under him govern themselves accordingly so that the children can likewise do the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. We hope you receive something from this message. Yeah.
And we want to welcome you back to our third episode, right? This is a series and it's an ongoing series. So in our next episode, we will be exploring a little bit more about, bleeding and childbirth and blood and uncleanness as it relates to women of childbearing age. And, we want to get into what happens and how we can purify ourselves after going through that birthing experience. All right. We want to thank you for tuning in to our second episode and welcome you to the third one. If you are interested in becoming a part of the Anu Life Global Ministries, please head on over to anulifeglobal.org and register and, like, share, and subscribe. Peace.
If you are interested in learning more or joining ANU, you can apply to be sponsored by a current ANU member and considered for membership. Candidates must complete the full application on our website, www.anulifeglobal.org.